Hello, my name is John Fisher, and this is Johnson, Philip Johnson, and the Price of American Architecture. In 1987, I came back from New York City. I'd had a rough time there, and I came home to move in with my husband, Michael, who I've been with the whole time. I had to get a job, so I got a job at a bookstore. I wanted to work amongst books. I loved being amongst books. I worked in many bookstores in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all over the place, and I loved them. And I thought, this is great. I'll just have time with the books. And one thing I wanted to look into was architecture. I wanted to learn about architecture. Now, Michael, my husband, loves architecture. I'd always been into art and, of course, performing arts, but now I was discovering the wonderful world of building. The great thing about a building is you can enter it. It's not just like a plastic painting. It's not just like something hanging on the wall or a performance that you're watching. You actually go into it, go to the top of it, and look at it from a distance and look at it close. It's like an interactive sculpture or a painting that you can enter. You actually become a part of it. It's there for you, and it's functional. It's a fully functional work of art. I had the best teachers in that bookstore. You see, I had the night shift, and they encouraged us to read. And once we'd done our tasks, if business was slow, we could just sit back and read. And that's where I found my teachers, the best architecture teachers ever. Tom Wolfe, Bauhaus to our house. My favorite Tom Wolfe, loved him. Vincent Scully, I heard him lecture once, a great lecturer and a great writer. My favorite, Paul Goldberger, the architecture reviewer for the New York Times. Wonderful writer. And note the cover, because we'll get back to this cover. That's a very famous building on this cover. Very significant to tonight's discussion. And, of course, Ada Louise Huxtable, who had preceded Paul Goldberger as the critic for the New York Times in architecture. And last, but definitely not least, and certainly the largest and heaviest, Robert Stearns, New York. Yes, Robert A.M. Stern, his series on New York City. There are 4 or 5 of this volume, so working on a new one. 20 years each, covering all the new buildings in New York. We could pore over this for hours. And the book that we love to take on vacation best of all, This City Observed by Paul Goldberger. New York City architecture, block by block. You can walk all over the city and read this book. Wonderful. We loved it. We loved it. I was learning about the aesthetics of architecture and the artistry, the history, not the building of it. I actually took a class at College of Marin, and the teacher kept saying, don't try this at home. Don't try to build a pyramid at home. Don't try to build a classical, like baths of Caracalla at home. Don't do pre-stressed concrete at home. He was always emphasizing that he was just teaching history. We shouldn't try to build stuff at home, not this complicated stuff. I was learning all about the periods of architecture, the classical periods, the Roman, the Greek, the Hellenistic, the Near Eastern, the Renaissance, the medieval, the Baroque, the Rococo, the neoclassical, all the way up to the America. And of course, I wanted to act and being creative on stage. But unfortunately, if you're just young and creative and you don't really know that many people, San Francisco theater can be, well, a little unkind to you. It's still that way. Anyway, I was falling in love with American architects. I loved all of them. Thomas Jefferson with his wonderful Monticello, and the brilliant University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Incredible, those domes. Charles Bulfinch with his own beautiful gold dome in the middle of Boston. Louis Sullivan and his skyscrapers, and of course, a local favorite who built all across the United States, Frank Lloyd Wright, and his wonderful houses. But my only frustration was I wanted to find somebody that I could grow with, that would be there day by day, building buildings that I would read about in the New York Times, covered by Paul Goldberger. And that's when I discovered Philip Johnson. Yes, the master architect. He had been key in developing the concept of the international style. And here's the catalog for that first show, the Museum of Modern Art in 1932, the International Style. He also had collaborated with one of the greatest modernists of all time, Mies van der Rohe from Germany, on the Seagram Building. There it is, the majestic prize of modern architecture, 1958 on Park Avenue. So sleek, so modern, so new. And here's an I-beam, which was the only ornament on the Seagram Building. Now, that has no function. It's a functional device, a functional member, but it's not used functionally here. It's just used here as the only ornamentation on that building to celebrate what makes that building stand up. the beauty, the simplicity, the cleverness of that idea to cover it with I-beams that didn't do anything. They just celebrated what made the building stand. But my favorite of all of Philip Johnson's buildings were his glass house. There it is, look at it, with the chimney in the center. Remember that chimney? Steel and glass, you can see right through it. There's no there, the ultimate modernist structure. And a personal favorite is Bank of America in Houston. I love this building. Look at that. That's a skyscraper with Dutch Gothic architecture soaring up as if it was on a massive canal. A skyscraper in Houston with Dutch classical architecture. Also, the Danish guild halls are referenced here. Wonderful, transported back to the Middle Ages, to the Renaissance in the middle of Houston in this ginormous building. He was the prophet of modernism, the saint of postmodernism, and he was the first starchitect. Here he is reclining in front of his glass house. Look at him, the first starchitect in front of that beautiful steel and glass structure with only one thing visible, the chimney. And here he is with his glasses. He created his own glasses. Look at that. Hey, they were based on Le Corbusier's glasses, the great French architect, but he made them all his own and he always wore them. He was a walking advertisement for himself, like Andy Warhol, like Keith Haring, a walking advertisement. And this is what I love most about Philip Johnson. He was gay. I love that he was gay. And here is his boyfriend of many, many years, David Whitney, reclining on one of Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. Yes, there he was at the middle of modern sculpture, modern art, and modern architecture. The wonderful David Whitney, a curator himself at the Castelli Gallery. And here they are together, Philip Johnson and David Whitney. So let's check in and see if we can hear a little bit from Philip Johnson himself. Hello, Philip Johnson here, Mr. Johnson, or Dr. Johnson. I'm thrilled to hear that a gay man was inspired by me. I came out in 1993. I was 87. It was about time. I was with the same man for 45 years. I was born rich, which is the best way to be born. It gives you endless possibilities. I wanted to be many things. I wanted to be famous, controversial, creative, and famous. As Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. I'm very pretentious about my buildings until somebody calls me on my pretension, and then I simply say, I'm a whore. That's really the only explanation for my buildings. Pay me enough and I'll do anything, absolutely anything, just like a whore. Though I have heard whores say, please don't come in my hair. So in that way, I suppose they have more integrity than I do. I loved Philip Johnson because I fancied that we had a lot of things in common. He was incredibly rich, unlike me, but he didn't fit in college. He went to Harvard and he was a poor student. He just didn't fit in there. I think because he must have felt his outsiderness as a gay man. When he graduated from college, he invested in the Museum of Modern Art. He gave them money to start an architecture department, and he became the first director of that architecture department. And the first show he did, the first catalog he created was for the International style. Now, the International style was very interesting because there's a refutation of everything that had preceded it in modern American architecture. It was moving beyond that. Architecture before that was very, very early century, we'll call it, as opposed to mid-century. And he found great modernists in Europe, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and he brought their style to the United States and argued for it in this great show, the International style. So here is a glimpse of American architecture in the early 30s. Here is the Chrysler Building, of course, the wonderful Chrysler Building, magnificent, that huge building, looks like a car, doesn't it? All sparkling with steel, shiny. Look at the downspouts, the gargoyles there, heavy, monumental, triumphant, a celebration. like a Gothic structure or a Baroque structure or a Rococo structure, a celebration of America, all ornamentation and massive and powerful. Also representative of the period, the early 30s, Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie House. Here's the Robie House. Now, very different from the Chrysler Building, not as much ornamentation, but a different kind of ornamentation. Still, the windows are not a big feature of it. There's a lot of coloration, a lot of banding. You see ornament there in that urn right there. Lots of ornamentation in its own way. But with the international style and the show that it engendered, suddenly we have Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. And now architecture would be redefined. Modern architecture coming from Europe, now being defined as the international style. And this new architecture was very different from the Chrysler Building and the Robie House. It was boxy, as you can see, light, no ornamentation on the Villa Savoye, as you see there. Steel, glass, seems to float, flat surfaces, no color, a very simple structure, almost transparent, incredible, a whole new way of thinking about building. After World War II, he got a PhD in architecture from Harvard, and then he created his own glass house, that famous structure that we looked at before. There it is. Remember the chimney? Remember the steel and glass? You can almost see through it, almost floats like the Villa Savoye, although even more so, it almost doesn't exist. It's a completely transparent building, a celebration of what is possible in architecture, a minimalist conception. This, of course, was based on Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion. And Michael and I love to explore architecture. We went to this building. We love to go in buildings. It's in Barcelona, of course, and it was built in the early 30s. And when you go inside it, it's almost like you're not inside. There are no doors. You're just sort of wandering in, wandering out, wandering in, wandering out. And that's the modernist aesthetic, a building that almost doesn't exist. And it inspired Philip Johnson to create his own glass house, an American building in New Canaan, Connecticut, that almost doesn't exist. When Mies van der Rohe came over from Germany, he collaborated with Philip Johnson on the Seagram Building, the triumph of modern architecture. Look at it. So stately, so massive, like the Chrysler Building, but simple, completely simple, boxy, almost floating. And there are those I-beams again, those wonderful I-beams, the member, the piece of building that made all of this glass and lightness possible, celebrated as the only ornamentation on this building. Incredible. Of course, Johnson's main contribution to the Seagram Building was the Four Seasons restaurant. He did the interiors, and here's the Four Seasons. Look at it. It's just like being in his glass house, except it's a restaurant. There's very little coloration. There's very little decoration. Steel and glass and this huge open space, a celebration not of architecture, but of space, of people within the space. And this is where Johnson held forth for years at a corner table. He'd receive guests, he'd receive potentates, he would encourage young architects like Richard Meyer and Frank Gehry. He was the master of the Four Seasons, and he had created it. So let's check back in with Mr. Johnson on his movement in this early period of his career, when he was a true modernist, having coined the phrase in America. My early career was defined by a search for self. I was a very lonely gay man, but then all of us were. Fortunately, I was rich. Money cocooned me as a homosexual, and I realized that in architecture, I would have to align myself with the new movement if I wanted to be famous. I would have to align myself with modernism. I was key in getting the two great modernist architects out of Hitler's Germany, Walter Gropius of the Bauhaus and Mies van der Rohe. And when I entered architecture myself, it was as Mises Monti. He guided me in my growth as a modernist. Oh, he was a very gruff man with those big cigars and that big chest. So discretion, in my case, was key. I was, during this period, for the clients, for the press, and for Mies, I was in the closet. So now we enter upon my favorite period in Philip Johnson's career, which was his postmodernist period. And I had a lot of personal experiences of his buildings in the postmodernist period. I loved his postmodernist architecture. My first favorite, I should say, the one I discovered in New York when I was living there, was the State Theater at Lincoln Center. There it is. No longer as austere as the Seagram Building. It has its own majesty, a reference back to the old theaters of La Scala and l'Opéra in Paris, with those huge columns and those decorated lobbies, with the city thundering above it in the background. Now, there are 3 theaters at Lincoln Center. There's the Metropolitan Opera and Avery Fisher Hall, which are impressive in their own way, but I don't like them because the auditoriums bizarrely seem cramped. And even more than that, the lobbies are cramped. There's no place to move. There's no place to see people because you're just bumping into people all the time. You're just crowded by people. But the State Theater is wonderful inside. Here's the auditorium. And there you see he's getting back to ornamentation. The postmodern aesthetic. Bring the ornamentation back. Bring it all back. It's classical. It's modern. But it's classical in its decorative elements. All that red. All those lights. And there was space in this auditorium. So much space. It feels so grand. And the best part of all was the lobby. There it is, with those wonderful promenades on the different levels. Now, if you wanted to crowd around people, you could go down on the base level at the bottom and bump into all the important people, or you could stay up top and promenade and look at people and they would look at you. This is one of my favorite lobbies in New York because it has space, because it has majesty, because it celebrates the people inside of it. And that way it's the best combination of modernism, celebrating the people inside, and postmodernism, decorative, accessible, fabulous. You know, this is also an important theater because it has surprisingly good acoustics. And now when you see something there, and I've seen a lot of opera and ballet and even musical comedy there, everything's amplified. But back then, the acoustics were good enough that when they revived Annie Get Your Gun in 1966, 20 years after its premiere with Ethel Merman, she could still fill that theater, that massive modern theater, with an unamplified voice. And the wags used to quip, it wasn't Annie Get Your Gun, it was Granny Get Your Gun because she was 20 years older. But nevertheless, she showed them by singing her heart out and filling that theater, that voice, a triumph for Ethel Merman and Philip Johnson. In 1976, he created the last word in modernism, the Penzoil Plaza in Houston. There it is, those magnificent geometric structures, steel and glass, no ornamentation, no coloration, a modernist epic, but wonderful, tending towards majesty, beyond the Seagram Building in many ways, those 2 towers soaring up, almost colliding with each other, threatening, but majestic and wonderful. And then in 1980, the Crystal Cathedral. I love this building. I drove out to Pasadena just to see it. This was created for this massive evangelical church. And the pastor had started with his wife in empty drive-in theaters. He would give his sermons, his services in empty drive-ins, and his wife would play this old organ on top of a snack bunker, and people would drive up and park, and that was perfect for LA, the car city. So when he built this massive Crystal Cathedral, Philip Johnson gave it a huge door that would open up to the parking lot. So if you couldn't fit in with thousands of other people in the biggest glass building on the planet, if you couldn't fit in there, the doors would open up and you could see the pastor. Also, it was built for television because he had millions of viewers as pastor. It is now owned by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It's now a Catholic church. And I loved it when I went there because I was like, what is this weird thing with this huge parking lot and this door that opens? It's a church. Whoever thought? And of course, his masterpiece, Philip Johnson's, the AT&T Building in New York City, 1984. He was given the commission and he won it. He won it because he put that Chippendale high boy roof on top of it. It was a complete refutation of modernism. It was all about decoration now. And AT&T loved it. They were a powerful corporation then, and they wanted to make a statement, and they got the right guy to do it. The Chippendale high boy, and he denied that it was. What was it? Was it a phone cradle? Well, apparently Robert Venturi, another great architect, was none too happy because he had put the same top on his mother's house. He built a house for his mother, but much smaller. But Johnson didn't care. He was happy to steal from people. He always stole from the right people, though. That's what was impressive. And it had this huge arched entryway, 7 stories tall, 70 feet wide, majestic. And the stone came from the same quarry that supplied that beautiful stone for Grand Central Station, just a few blocks away. It was a massive undertaking, and it worked. It took 10 years to build, but it was impressive and beautiful, and it brought postmodernism roaring into the American century. So successful was this building that he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. There he is, Philip Johnson, as if he was holding Noah's tomb, the 10 commandments coming down from on high, having spoken to God. He was truly the first starchitect. But a favorite of mine was right nearby on 3rd Avenue, the Lipstick Building. Now, his developer, Hines, who we knew from Houston, wanted to develop 3rd Avenue as a business avenue. Now, 3rd Avenue was considered very déclassé, but Hines knew that if he got Johnson to build a signature building, that he might attract other businesses over there. And you can see, this is a recent picture, it's surrounded by skyscrapers now. When it was built, nothing. And in 1985, the Lipstick Building rose. I love this building because it reminded me of my mother's little lipstick thing and her compact. It sent me all the way back, and it was actually round. And there's the coloration coming back. All of the modernist things thrown out and the postmodern roaring in this beautiful ellipse of a building. And this was especially appealing to me because it was right near a hotel that Michael and I used to stay in, the Pickwick Arms, this old Fleabag hotel. And it became the Capsule Hotel, and I stayed there. And then I stay at the 47th Street Y because there's a pool in the basement. And when I walk out, I walk up 3rd Avenue, and I pass the Lipstick Building, then I take a left turn, and I pass the Seagram Building, and then I walk past, yes, the AT&T Building. I have a whole journey of Philip Johnson in all the great phases of his career as I'm headed to MoMA, where he started, or as I'm headed to Broadway, where I love to go see shows. Incredible. Now, he didn't just work in New York, he worked all over the United States. And a great contribution of his to San Francisco is 101 California. Here it is, the Silo Building. Yes, it looks like a huge grain silo thrown up above us on these huge pylons. It's like it's exposing the way the building's built. It's a horrifying building because it looks like it's going to crash down on top of you, but majestic from a distance. This beautiful round grain silo in the middle of the city from 1982. And I had the pleasure of having an office in this building for a short time. And it's incredible because it's not actually round. It's actually just made up of a lot of glass planes. Plane, and they create the ellipse. And when you're inside of it, you see all these flatness, all this flatness that contributes to make a big round building. And the hallways are round. Everything is very odd inside, but wonderful and unique. And just up California Street is 580 California Street. A building that a lot of professional architects think is just kitsch. Just old-time kitsch, but I loved it. I loved it, and I'll tell you why. I love its massing, I love the mansard roof, I love all that about it, but I especially love, on the top, yes, the corporate goddesses, they're called. These beautiful goddesses, 3 on each side, 12 of them, and there's no there there. They're the goddesses of corporation, and all they are is fabric, showing off fabric. There's no heart, there's no soul, there's no flesh, there's no face, there's nothing. They're just empty. What a wonderful statement about big business in America, about industry. You can see them from the ground, you can see them from on high. They're wonderful. And as I say, many people think this is just kitsch, just silly, but he put them there, and I think they're magnificent. Well, he started getting into a lot of trouble because in 1987, the same year that he put the corporate goddesses on top of 580 California Street, he also opened up One International Place in Boston. Now, this was a massive development, this One International Place in Boston, these huge buildings soaring into the sky in Boston. Now, the city fathers were trying to develop a small neighborhood in Boston for business. They hired Philip Johnson to build these buildings, and he said, oh, okay, I'll build them, and they'll be Palladian. There'll be Palladian aspects. The windows will be Palladian. Well, what it ended up with is just being this huge thing. You can see the scale of the neighborhood before in that little building right there on the right. It just became this massive thing. And at some big architect's confab, he was confronted by another one of the starchitects who asked him, what design principle did you apply in developing One International Place Boston? This thing is completely out of control. And he said, I do not believe in principles. I'm a whore. What a comeback. I had my own reservations. Here's an example, 33 Maiden Lane, 1985 in downtown Manhattan. Now you see, the building on the side is a Renaissance building with medieval crenellated aspects, and he wanted to reference that, so he created an office building, which was a big castle. I don't think this really works. I never have. When seen from the ground, you can't even see the crenellated towers. They're not even all that visible here at a mid-height photograph. So I think the whole gesture was sort of small and sort of halfway. Also, there were budgetary concerns. He didn't get the stone he wanted, so he got sort of this chintzy, low-impact stone. The coloration is very weak. I do not think this was a successful postmodernist building. The attempt was there, and the ideas were there. It just didn't quite come off, certainly not from the ground. So let's check in with Mr. Johnson on his postmodernist period. I grew sick of modernism. I wanted to express myself. Modernism now seems so anal, so constipated. So I invented postmodernism. Well, I stole it. But that's a form of invention. I'm sure Oscar Wilde had something to say about that, stealing. Postmodernism was a return to the ornamentation, the fun, the celebration of beauty and grandeur. A sellout, you call me? Well, yes, I was. But I was grateful that I had at least something to sell. And it was the 60s, the age of revolution. And then it was the 70s, the me generation. I wanted to revolt and be me, fabulous, gay, fun. And then it was the 80s, the Reagan era, money. And so I wanted to create pyramids, cathedrals of money. I even built buildings for Donald Trump. He was a lovely client, kind of stupid, but lovely. I'd always heard rumors about Johnson's politics, not his politics now or the time that I was getting into him, but before, from the 30s, from the time of world fascism. The rumors, I thought, did he just do something wrong? Did he go to the wrong meeting? Did he just give money to the wrong person? I wasn't quite clear on what he actually was. And then in 2018, a book came out written by a man named Mark Lamster. It's a very interesting book, Philip Johnson, The Man in the Glass House. And he talked about Johnson's time in the 30s, and he talked about it in detail. Johnson fell under the sway of Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest and a demagogue. He had 30 million listeners on his radio show. He was a racist. He railed against FDR. He called him a Mexican lover, an immigrant lover. And he took his New Deal, which was saving America from depression. He took it, and Father Coughlin called it the Jew Deal. What a racist. He said it was all backed by Jewish bankers. It was all conspiracy. He sounded like Hitler. And here you can see the gestures are Hitlerian. Here he is. And he had a massive following. And in 1936, he was trying to bring down President Roosevelt. And here we see a rally of his, which is modeled after the Nuremberg rallies in Nazi Germany. You can see it, the crowds. You can see the long, skinny flags of the Nazi flag at the Nuremberg rallies. You can see the lionization of an American hero, George Washington, turned into a Siegfried, turned into a Frederick the Great, a master warrior who will inspire us to move forward. At his next rally in Chicago in 1936, the rostrum was designed by Philip Johnson, and he based it on Mussolini's rostrum in Rome, where he gave his speeches to the fascist hordes. You can see travertine, massive travertine marble rostrum with the flags flying above it. Of course, it wasn't travertine. It was just plaster of Paris. It was all disposable, but it was meant to have that same massive grandeur. Look at the crowd. 30 million followers he had. Well, unfortunately for him, for Coughlin, not for the country, he was brought down. FDR was reelected, and the Vatican told Coughlin to cool it. They said they didn't want him giving any more speeches. They didn't want him to be so political. They didn't want him spouting so much hate, and he was silenced. So Johnson was frustrated. So he created the Young Nationals Party. This was an American fascist party, and its purpose was to make Johnson a fascist ruler in the United States. He created a pamphlet on race, and in that pamphlet, he attacked all Americans who used birth control, white Americans, because he was afraid the white race was losing the race. He had a radio show too, and on that, he was conservative. He spouted hate. Here's a picture of him by the great queer photographer Carl van Vaechten from this period. He went to Germany a couple of times. Remember, he was rich, he was wealthy, his father had been a rich attorney, and he traveled in Germany a lot, meeting German leaders. He was thrilled by the Nazi rallies in Nuremberg and throughout Germany. He was thrilled by the excitement of fascism. He wanted to rule back in the United States. He wanted to meet everybody. He wanted to inspire fascism in the United States. He went as a correspondent for Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic magazine, Social Justice. And in Germany, he was met on a junket by William Shirer, the great writer of Berlin Diary. And Shirer referred to him in Berlin Diary as the American fascist, Philip Johnson. War broke out between Germany and Poland. And this is bizarre. He had made many trips to Poland before, during, and after the German invasion of Poland. He was thrilled by the bombing of Polish cities. He was excited by the attacks on Polish towns. He thought the whole war blitzkrieg was beautiful. And as you noticed in the previous slide, there were tanks and horses. The Germans could overwhelm the Poles easily. That dead horse beside the tank? Yes, a cavalry attack on tanks. The Germans were just bullies. Here are bombers over Warsaw. He was thrilled by the bombing. Philip Johnson thrilled by the bombing of Polish cities. And here is the remains of Warsaw after the bombing. Yes, which Johnson found beautiful. The Poles deserved it because they were Untermensch. He had studied Nietzsche when he felt alienated in college. He'd studied Nietzsche and he'd been taught about Übermensch, the Germans, and the Untermensch, people like the Poles, their city destroyed. And also he found inspiration for his architecture in Poland because he saw things like this burnt house. Does it look familiar? We see members and open air, steel and glass. He pointed this house as inspiration for his own glass house, a structure that doesn't exist as a structure that you can see through. The burnt buildings of Poland, and also the chimneys that were left after a huge bombing raid. All that was left of a village were the chimneys. Remember the chimney in the glass house? Another inspiration for Philip Johnson. Destruction, ruin. Oh my God, that's modern architecture. He was thrilled by his time in Poland. He found it exciting. Well, he came back to the United States, and in 1941, the United States came into the war, and he was interviewed by the FBI about his fascist background, interviewed many times, and finally they decided that he was harmless, completely harmless. He was a failed fascist, which is about the best you could say for him in this period. And when I heard about this, I was so disillusioned. Here was this gay master architect whose work I'd followed and loved through all its periods. And now I found out he'd gone through 10 years of fascism. How can you shake that off? How can that not still be a part of his makeup? Let's hear from Mr. Johnson on this period in his life. In my defense, after the war, I designed for free a synagogue in Port Chester, New York, and an atomic research facility for the Israelis in Israel. I always promoted the work of Jewish American architects, Frank Gehry most especially. As for my political activities in the 1930s, I feel only guilt. I can't explain it. How do you explain guilt? You can't, it's impossible. It was a monumentally stupid thing for me to do. And it was nothing more than opportunism. Opportunism, that's all it was. And I regret it. Well, that's interesting. Was his regret, was his taking on those commissions, was his promoting Jewish architects also opportunism? Was he trying to clean up his name in retrospect? He was always asked about this through his career. He always expressed regret. Was he just keeping an eye on the bottom line? As I said, the best book on this subject is Mark Lamster's Philip Johnson, The Man in the Glass House, and he documents in detail the 30s, which is a fascinating chapter. And the time he spent in Germany and Poland is bizarre. It is, I hate to say it, it's a fascinating read because you really see things you never expected from this man, this homosexual man promoting fascism. Wasn't he aware of what was happening to homosexuals in Nazi Germany? And it's all there in Lamster's book. I do offer a word of caution about Lamster's book because on top of not respecting Johnson because he was a fascist, which of course makes sense, He doesn't like his architecture, which of course is opinion, and he details everything that's wrong with Johnson's architecture throughout his career. But he also, I think inadvertently, drifts into homophobia. It almost seems like he's condemning Johnson for his homosexuality at times. And I don't think Lamster is quite as sensitive to how difficult it was to be a queer man in the early part of the 20th century in America. An interesting book, a fascinating book, an important book, but to be read with caution. Unintentional homophobia, it's there. And it sort of undermines a lot of his argument, which is needful, an unfortunate aspect of a very important book. Well, there are two more Johnson stories that arose even as I was preparing this piece. I was talking to David Draper, who's this wonderful costume designer who we work with, and he said, are you going to talk about how Philip Johnson destroyed the city of Paris in San Francisco, that wonderful department store? Here it is, the city of Paris in San Francisco. And Johnson was always talking about preservation. He marched against the destruction of the Pennsylvania station in New York City, and he was always about preservation, and yet he willfully participated in the destruction of this wonderful department store in the city of Paris, which my mother always talked about. It was her favorite department store in San Francisco because of its glass ceiling. Well, the glass ceiling was preserved, but this is the postmodernist edifice that Johnson put in the place of that beautiful building. It's made of wonderful materials. It's a solid structure, expensive, but it is brutal as heck, right on Union Square. Not nearly as much fun as the city of Paris, that great classical structure. And a weird story about this is the Preservation Committee was discussing this, the preservation of the city of Paris, and Philip Johnson attended. He was pretty much on the spot because his structure was going to replace the old city of Paris. But during the whole discussion, he sat there reading a copy of Sherlock Holmes. He wasn't going to be swayed, not when his fee was so large. Huh? Also, Joe Talley, who you know from these broadcasts, when I was telling him about the project, he said, oh, you're going to talk about the United Church of Christ in Dallas. And this is a church for the LGBT Christian community. And I said, no, I didn't know about it. I never even heard about it. It was one of Johnson's last structures. And I looked it up, and this is what I found. Magnificent. Why? Because it's not like anything else that Johnson ever built. And if he helped somebody like Frank Gehry, as he bragged for political reasons, one nice thing to see is that he was obviously influenced by Frank Gehry, because this is a very Gehry-esque structure with the biomorphic forms. And I was touched that he was building something for the LGBT community. I'm not sure I'm not disillusioned any longer, but it was a nice coda to his career, influenced by a younger architect who he had promoted, and also now working for the LGBT community. So what to do with my hero worship now that I lost my hero because I realized that he was a fascist and had abjured fascism just because he failed and also wanted to succeed as an architect? What was I going to do? I need an architectural hero. Well, there is another one, and he is local. And he too is a postmodernist, a contemporary of Philip Johnson's, and he created some incredible structures, and he was queer. He was as gay as they come. Charles Moore, a brilliant architect who worked a lot in the Bay Area and also was a teacher at UC Berkeley. And here is his Sea Ranch, which is probably his most famous structure, these beautiful condominiums at Sea Ranch, wonderful postmodernism. Influential structures, really profoundly influential. But here's my favorite of his, which is the Beverly Hills Civic Center. I love this building. And if you're ever in Los Angeles, I encourage you to go there and walk all over it. It's good for a full afternoon. You see the older structure, the tower there. Well, he built this wonderful complex that goes on for blocks around it. And it feels like you're in Morocco or something, like you're in that old movie Casablanca with the palm trees and the hot weather. It's a celebration of California, a celebration of heat of the tropics. And it's a wonderful postmodernist building. You see the coloration, the decorative elements, the interaction with the environment. It's a terrific building. Unfortunately, a lot of his structures could be kind of lumbering. Here's the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. I've never understood this structure. It was one of his last buildings. It's hulking, it's overwhelming. It's almost a blight on that whole end of the campus. It goes on forever. It sort of overwhelms you. It doesn't feel people-friendly. It doesn't even feel necessarily like it's all that well decorated. It's a lumbering structure. And many of his buildings didn't survive. The house he built for his mother, the Moore House in Orinda, was, again, a benchstone of postmodernism. Modernism turned into postmodernism, this incredible structure. But it hasn't survived. I spent a whole afternoon riding around the Orinda Hills on my bike in July. I was sweating, dripping off of me, and suddenly I saw it through the trees, but it wasn't really there anymore. It had been buried in a larger structure. I could see little bits of it, but it had been erased, as if it wasn't even a landmark, as if he wasn't even important. And probably his most famous structure after Sea Ranch is the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, this wonderful celebration of postmodern aesthetic. You see all the elements there, the color, the ornamentation, the fun, the joy, the spirit, the gayness, the queerness, if you want, of postmodernism. And it was meant to sort of enliven the part of New Orleans that was not as exciting to visitors as the French Quarter, and it really did. It had water flowing through it. Children loved to play there, but we keep reading about how it might be destroyed. And when we were there 3 years ago, we made a pilgrimage to it, like we love to do. We love to go see architecture. We made a pilgrimage, and it was in horrible state of repair. A lot of it was surrounded and boarded up with boards and chain link. The paint was peeling off it. The water wasn't running. It looked like it had been deliberately left to decay so that somebody could make an argument for destroying it. And this is true of a lot of his buildings. It's hard to lose yourself in Charles Moore because there isn't a lot of respect for his stuff. A lot of it has gone by the wayside, disappeared. So I'm left going back to Philip Johnson, the starchitect, and wondering about him. Maybe he did move on, maybe he did change. People do change, they do grow, they become sophisticated. That was his plea, that was his excuse. That's what he said. He said it was stupid. It was monumentally stupid. It was a bad idea. But he did, all through his career, describe himself as a whore. And you can think of that as a joke. But the way he defined a whore was somebody who will do anything. And what if fascism had taken off in this country, in the United States? We had concentration camps where the Japanese Americans were interned during the war. So what would happen? What would happen if a fascist American government was looking around for an architect to build a death camp? Wouldn't a whore be the perfect person for that assignment? Is it really that hard to imagine Philip Johnson building an Auschwitz or a Dachau? Scary to think about. A fascist who then grew out of fascism and playfully, perhaps, or maybe not, described himself and his aesthetic as those of a whore. Thank you so much for joining me. I am John Fisher. This has been Johnson, Philip Johnson and the Price of American Architecture. And we have some programs coming up. Next week, I'll be doing a solo piece on Thursday about Modjeska, Helena Modjeska, the great San Francisco actress who took America by storm as the greatest Shakespearean of the 19th century. And on Tuesday, we have a wonderful new play by Stuart Bussell. So please join us on Tuesday at 7 o'clock for the next in our reading series. If you'd like to support our theater, and it's still Queer July, I call it Queer July, you can do so by donating to our theater on our website, therhino.org, and you can click on that and send us a donation. We can certainly use your help during COVID-19. We've been producing 2, sometimes 3 shows a week ever since it started. This is my 16th production. So we've been trying to provide as much entertainment as possible, but we're only able to do it with the generous support of viewers like you. But more than anything, thank you so much for joining me this evening, and keep looking at that architecture. Good night.